All right, let's get cooking here. Another lively day on the pod. It's Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I'm Dan Besbris. It's Thursday, July the 25th. We're winding out the month of July, which is really the last kind of dog days month of the fantasy basketball offseason. This is pretty much the end of it. Once we hit August, it's freaking go time. Let's see. What do we got going on here today? Got some settings that aren't working. That's fun. Delightful. Don't know why that's not working, but guess that's where we're at. All right, I guess we'll just get rolling. So it goes. Something's not working, you figure out a way. Today we're talking Jazz and Mavericks on the pod. And there's plenty to go over there. The Mavericks had a number of changes, but it's not entirely clear how much that actually changed fantasy values. Utah, I would argue, didn't have as many changes, and yet they're probably the more interesting and or complicated version here because we still don't really know what the Jazz are trying to do. Week to week, month to month basis kind of thing. We know Lauri Markkanen is on the trade block. That's probably the biggest thing hanging over Utah at the moment. But we don't know if he's going to get moved. We don't know who they're going to get for him. There's just all this stuff that's still sort of floating that could go either way. So where to begin? Well, I'd begin by trying to figure out why my computer's not doing the things I want it to do, but I think the audio side of the pod should be working fine. Why can't I get the roster to pull up? Pull up, roster. What are we doing here? This is extraordinarily annoying. All right, screw it. Let's just get going. All right, here's the Utah roster. Those that are looking at the YouTube feed, you guys can see it from Basketball Monster. These are the ranks from last year. We'll read through them, so fear not. You're not going to miss out on anything if you're on the listening side of the ledger. Of course, Lauri was the guy. There were 3 Jazz that finished inside the top 100 in 9-cat. There was a 4th that was extraordinarily close, and after a slow start, he very much was there the rest of the way. So it's probably more enlightening, more insightful to look at the second half of the season for Utah. What do these guys do basically from mid-January on? That's when the team has made a lot of their kind of who gets to do what decisions. You could even go as far as the last 2 months, say sort of all-star break to the end of the year. That's also relatively illuminating, although, from a sample size standpoint, you probably don't quite get enough. So I would lean more towards the second half. In the second half of the season, I would argue that there were 4 Jazz that were generally worth using on the 9-cat side. Those 4 were Lauri Markkanen, John Collins, Walker Kessler, and Colin Sexton. We're going to start with Walker Kessler because I might argue that he was the most complicated Jazz to figure out last year. It seemed like he was part of their plans. They gave him money. They gave him the starting job for a bit. Then there was a mysterious arm injury, and he never really quite found himself. Second half of the year, Kessler averaged 22.5 minutes per game. That actually did trend down over the final 2 months, but mostly it was just that the block rate wasn't there at the very end of the year, and that's why I wanted to go more to this slightly larger sample size. It's very hard to know if Utah's about to pivot back into Walker Kessler. He seemed like he was ready to explode onto the fantasy scene, not at the end of this most recent season, but the end of the previous one. And so he was getting drafted around 50 because the prior year, after the All-Star break, Walker Kessler was a top 30 guy. And that just simply didn't pan out because the minutes weren't there. Expectation was that he was going to play starters minutes, and he didn't get those. 22, 23 minutes a game is pretty different than 28 to 30. So he ended up second half of the season. These are the numbers, again, you're looking at on your screen. Second half of the year, Kessler averaged 7.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, still had 2.2 blocks and a good field goal percent. And actually, his free throw wasn't all that bad in that zone. But you didn't get the big rebound impact. You didn't get the big field goal percent impact because he only took 4.8 shots per game because he just wasn't on the court enough. The reasons for that are plentiful. And I apologize. Those that are watching live, you guys keep seeing me wiping my nose here on air. I got the allergies today. One of the big reasons is that Kessler just didn't evolve. It almost seemed like the FIBA World Championships brought out all of the worst, and the confidence went down, and he just wasn't able to extend his defensive range. And if you're not a big offensive force and you can't step out of the paint, teams that can run anything other than a traditional center at you are going to rip your defense apart. And so later in the year, you saw the Jazz go, and I know Kelly Olynyk got traded partway through also, but you saw the Jazz go to more of a John Collins at the 5 setup. Before we get to John Collins, who had an amazing second half of the year once they did make him basically the starting and full-time center on that roster, let's finish up with Walker Kessler. Because the big question hanging over Kessler and the Jazz in general is this a bounce-back season? The honest-to-goodness truth is that we can't really know. We don't know what the Jazz are going to do with their center position this year, but you can bet your butt that Kessler is going to be drafted real freaking late. And I think because of that, it's probably a worthwhile shot to take. Like, does anybody think Walker Kessler gets drafted inside the top 75? I don't. I really don't. I think he falls down where, like a Daniel Gafford was going last year, which was between 90 and 105. And in that range, I'd feel pretty comfortable taking Kessler because you kind of saw the floor for him last year. 22 minutes per game, hovering around the edge of the top 100. Sure, if you draft the guy at 95 and he finishes at 110, you're going to be like, this is annoying. I wanted a guy that was going to jump above. But because of the decent floor, you're probably going to get something out of that pick. And remember, one of the first shows we did on this new feed was talking to Josh Lloyd, and we got into sort of this, when is it a good time to take a shot? And most of your late picks, I'd say 8th round and deeper, should be guys that you think could explode. What if the Jazz trade Lauri Markkanen? That opens up, and if you're looking at the late minutes from last year, the lineup was largely Lauri Markkanen, Taylor Hendricks, and John Collins, and Kessler was getting kind of scraps. If you pull Markkanen's 34 minutes out of that mix, you probably force the Jazz to go big. They couldn't go a whole lot smaller, frankly. So Kessler comes on to play the 5. Collins slides down to the 4, and Hendricks continues to play on the wing. And you could say, oh, well, they might go into a full rebuild. Kessler was supposed to be part of this rebuild. So maybe that's the shot to take. And who the hell knows? Maybe the Jazz move on from John Collins at some point this year. I'm not saying that they definitely will, but he certainly did a lot to rehab his value with a good season last year, particularly a good second half of the season last year. And he's the next guy we're going to talk about. But also it's worth noting, Collins, he's got this year and then a player option on his contract. He's relatively tradable, although, again, a lot easier next year than this. But a team out there might see him and say, oh, look, we could use sort of like a 4-5, undersized 5, normal-sized 4 to go out there and do maybe a little more dirty work. Someone would have to have some cash, but it's conceivable. So there's all these narrow but non-existent pathways for Kessler to gain extra playing time outside of his own ability and the team's general plans. Like, again, and I guess this is the team's plans, but it's more of the GM's plans versus the players on the court. If the season starts right now, you can probably look at this team and say Kessler does generally what he did the second half of last year, something in the 20 to 23 minute range. If you get free throw shooting that doesn't completely obliterate your team, you're probably looking at a guy hovering near the top 100. If he goes into max punt free throw mode, then he falls off of that a little bit. If the minutes tick up by 1 or 2, you tap into a little bit of that upside. And if anybody gets traded, you tap into more of that. So I would look for Kessler anything beyond about pick 90 this coming year, because that's sort of where 90, 95, you get into the guys that just no longer have guaranteed playing time. And then you're hunting for dudes with upside and really good fantasy lines or fantasy stat sets. And Kessler could fall into that in sort of the traditional 9-cat big man mold. Let's talk about John Collins next, who, again, has this year on his contract as a player option for $27 million the following year, which I'll admit makes him a little bit tougher to trade because he's probably going to take that $27 million. I don't think a team's going to be giving him that in a new contract, but I guess you never know. But right now, at least it looks like, and I don't know, I mean, everything is sort of an on-paper situation, the Jazz probably roll out a starting lineup that's not super different than what they had at the end of last year. They've got some young guys they're, lightly excited about. But none of them is a guy, I mean, really outside of Kessler, that's about to just come in and roll into the center spot. The only one you'd have to worry about blowing up John Collins' value is Walker Kessler. So that's the twist there. John Collins, the second half of last year, was a top 50 fantasy player. He averaged 17 points, 9.5 rebounds, 1.7 combined steals and blocks, 1 3-pointer, and very good percentages. 57-81 were the splits there. He ended up being an extraordinarily versatile fantasy big man. And I know didn't block a crap ton of shots, but was just really, really good once they made him the 5. And this is the way it always goes. If you put a big-ish dude at the 5 instead of the 4, their fantasy numbers shoot through the roof of the building. Happens with everybody. And then the flip side also happens. And we talked about that a bunch yesterday in relation to, who the hell are we talking about? The Thunder. Like what would happen to Chet Holmgren if he has to soak up a bunch of minutes at the 4 instead of the 5. Karl Anthony Towns being the very good recent example of a 5 who moved to the 4. John Collins being the flip of that, the 4 that moved to the 5, and his fantasy numbers took off. He was sitting in the 125 range, just kind of languishing there as a doesn't matter kind of dude. And they were like, you know what? Screw this. You're our 5 now. Let's run and gun. And he took off. His minutes actually didn't change all that much, but his role changed so substantially, and his fantasy value jumped by 5 rounds. Am I going to draft John Collins at 50? Hell no. Because I don't have a clue what Utah's planning on doing. Is he going to become the 4? If Markkanen gets traded, that hurts his numbers, although because of how much gets left behind, he probably has enough to do there to stay in folks' good graces. But if Markkanen gets traded, are we looking at another season where Utah competes for 3 months and then blows it up the second half? Because look, at what you guys are looking at, if you're watching the YouTube feed, you're looking at the full season numbers, but the second half numbers. But it's important to also look at the full season numbers, most notably games played. There were 2 regular contributors on the Jazz who cracked 70 games played this last year. Keontae George, who played 75, and Colin Sexton, who's the next guy we're going to talk about, who played 78. John Collins wiggled his way to 68, which is salvageable. Walker Kessler only 64, although it seems like he was genuinely hurt there. And then Markkanen down at 55, simply too good, frankly, to play him more than 2/3 of a season when Utah was trying to collect a few more draft picks. Or better, not more, but better. So with Collins, I know the full season he was number 80. It was a tale of two halves, 120 for a half, 50 for a half, settled in between. I think that's probably around where he ends up getting drafted this year. I don't think, like, there are enough exciting players to fill up the top 60. And Collins is not an exciting player, even if you think he's going to have an okay season. It's that 60 to 95 stretch where you don't really know what order guys are going to end up falling. But I would bet, I don't know, a hill of beans, just one small hill of beans, that John Collins probably ends up getting drafted somewhere in that neck of the woods, unless some big news comes out. Like if Markkanen gets traded, he goes up. If they find out he's coming off the bench, he goes down. Barring that stuff happening over the next couple of weeks, because again, remember, quoth the great Dan Titus, Yahoo Leagues might be open 2 weeks from today. Collins is probably a guy that you target in that 75 to 100 range. And the deeper you can get him, the more chance you have of making it a useful play. Colin Sexton is the next name on the board. Remember, he got traded to Utah, and it seemed like he was a guy that they were going to invest in heavily because they gave him immediately a 4-year contract. And then he sort of didn't play. Admittedly, he was coming back from a massive injury that first year, but then this past season, it looked at the beginning of the year like Sexton wasn't really going to play again. And then things shifted. I don't remember exactly how far into the year it happened. I think it was about a month and a half, maybe like around December 1st or something like that. Here, let's do some play with some numbers on the screen. There you go. So beginning of the season through December 1st, Colin Sexton was number 257 in 9-cat. He was playing 20 minutes a game, and he simply wasn't involved. Walker Kessler was playing 24 and a half minutes over that stretch, although his field goal percent was weirdly low. John Collins was number 120. Remember that first month and a half for Utah? Things were real freaking different on that team. And then, all right, let's play this game again. Let's look at December 1st through, say, I don't know, end of the year, which was around that range. Then things started to pivot. John Collins was number 69. Colin Sexton was number 74 over that stretch. And I don't think that was the exact moment when it happened, but it wasn't all that far from there. This is a pretty good example, cross-section of the Jazz season as well. So Colin Sexton, from roughly the time he got the starting job to the end of the year, he was top 75 fantasy play. 50% from the field, 86 at the free throw line. That's where he excels the most. He'll score. He doesn't shoot a ton of three-pointers. Managed to collect a handful of assists because who the hell else was going to do it? Keontae George was just turning the ball over like every time down. Jordan Clarkson had a similar issue. So this Jazz team that was kind of without a traditional point guard, anybody that was a ball-handling guard could go and do a little distributing. In fact, over this same stretch, December 1st to the end of the year, Keontae George averaged over 4 assists. So did Jordan Clarkson. So did Chris Dunn. So did Colin Sexton. They really had 4 guys that were handing the basketball in some small amount. I have to believe that Colin Sexton is going to keep having a job for Utah, because once he was inserted, it didn't look like anything was about to come for his role. And he was one of the few guys who actually played out the tank stretch. Frankly, when they gave him the 4-year contract, it sure seemed like he was a guy that they were getting ready to build around a little bit. So I kind of have to believe that that's going to be the case again. Sexton's probably going to get a bit overdrafted because he scores, but he's also a relatively safe floor guy because he has good percentages. And I also wonder if, because he's mostly points and almost nothing else other than percentages, maybe he isn't a score-first player that gets pushed up the board in fantasy. Maybe he does fall to 75, 85, 90, something like that. In which case, I think he's also kind of an okay grab. Like, I'm seeing a lot of guys on Utah that I'd be sort of half comfortable taking a plunge on, provided your head-to-head league ends 3 weeks early, or if you're in a games cap format, because yeah, there's a huge chance again that some of these dudes are rested down the stretch. But again, we saw Sexton was not rested down the stretch this last year. Kessler was rested because he was hurt on and off. John Collins, games off here and there, but again, made it through most of the season. And then the only Jazz player that was, I would say, more of a what you'd call a traditional shutdown was the guy that they knew that they could get an arm, a leg, a boat, a house, a ship, a pile of diamonds, whatever, in the offseason. And that man is in the thumbnail for this episode, and that man is Lauri Markkanen. Before we get to Markkanen, quick reminder to please hit the like button if you're watching this show on a video format. If you're listening in an audio-only format, which, again, that's sort of my preferred way because you can do other things while it's playing. With video, you constantly have to put your eyes on it. Subscribe and drop a 5-star review. Spotify, Apple, whatever it is. We have, as I mentioned, begun to finally see kind of this growth of the show lately, which is extraordinarily exciting. Our show from Friday with Rhett Bauer is the most listened to episode by like a 6-7% clip over anything else, and growing still. And arguably the coolest part now of all of this is that the 5 most downloaded episodes have all occurred over the last 2 weeks. So we've gotten into July. Things are starting to pick up a little bit. I hope they continue to pick up. And the way that you guys can help with that is liking, subscribing, dropping those 5-star reviews. We want to kind of power boost this thing, especially as we turn. I mean, once leagues open, then I'm really going to need you guys to be doing stuff. Because a lot of folks, we've seen this happen 2, 3, 4 times, even live on air, where people are like, Dan, I just found you. People didn't know where I ended up. And I'm doing my best to tweet about it relentlessly. But some folks are not on Twitter as religiously as those of us tracking NBA news. So for that, I need your help. But in the meantime, let's talk about Lauri Markkanen, because over that December 1st to end of season stretch, Markkanen was number 14 in 9 category leagues, 23 points, 8 boards, 2.5 assists, 3 3-pointers, over 3 actually, 48% from the field, 92 at the free throw line, super low turnovers. He's never going to be a big steals or blocks guy, which I know you hear me talk about that and you're like, Dan, aren't you a guy who generally targets that stuff? Well, the beauty of the old man squad is that you can get those things later on. We just talked about Alex Caruso as a brilliant fill in the gaps kind of guy, where, I mean, if you ended up with Lauri Markkanen as your second rounder or whatever this last year, and he didn't get you much, he was at 1.4 combined defensive stats on the entire season, just 1.1. So he got off to a big defensive start, and then it tapered a little bit. You can cover that later. They're easy to find, I believe, steals in particular, because low-scoring guys who do that type of stuff get overlooked late in drafts, waiver wire, whatever. So don't worry so much about the fact that Markkanen is not a great defensive stats guy. What he brings in other categories is really special. He gives you a ton of three-pointers on a high field goal percent. And there are very few players in the NBA that can boast that type of combination. And the ones that exist typically exist near the top of the board. Luka Doncic hit 4 3-pointers a game last year. He shot 49% from the field. Massive combo. Kyrie, 3 3-pointers a game, 49.7% from the field. Kevin Durant, 2.2 at 52%. Not quite all the way there. Paul George, Tyrese Halliburton, they're around 3 threes at around 47, a little more than that percentage-wise. I mean, these are first-rounders we're talking about right now. Kawhi Leonard, 2 threes. He shot 52.5%. Once you get outside the second round, you basically aren't finding the 3 3-pointers guys with a good enough field goal percent to warrant that kind of positioning. Your best options there, De'Aaron Fox, 3 threes a game at 46.5% from the field, but he's a bad foul shooter. Desmond Bane was over 3 threes a game at 46.5% from the field. CJ McCollum, pretty similar. But you're probably not getting 48, 49, 50 or higher outside of basically like Grayson Allen. But of course, he did nothing else. He was 2.7 threes at 50% from the field and very low marks in almost everything else. And he ended up at number 58 without doing almost anything else. But that combination of a lot of three-pointers and helping your field goal percent, those guys are top of the board only. So Lauri Markkanen is a really useful fantasy player. Gets you rebounds as well. He's a 90% foul shooter. I love winning free throws in Roto. I love winning the percentages in Roto. The fear around Lauri Markkanen is warranted. He's been linked to a lot of teams in trade discussions so far this offseason. Probably the loudest would be the San Antonio Spurs. And if he ends up there, he's no longer the number one. So it goes. Now, there's the other half of it, which is like who goes back to Utah. Does it then clear out more space in San Antonio for Markkanen to get pretty close to what he was doing anyway? I mean, look, if Devin Vassell isn't one of the guys who goes back, then Markkanen is going to have to slot in, probably with fewer shots than Victor Wembanyama, maybe more than Vassell, but even still, he's not going to be that sort of untethered, unchallenged number one. And his fantasy value would take a small hit. I don't think it would be a huge one, but it would be something. I think you'd see the rebounds, the threes, the assists. I mean, they have a chance to stay relatively constant. The three, maybe not the threes. Rebounds, assists probably stay somewhat constant. If his minutes stay constant, that stuff probably doesn't change. But if you bring the usage down on Markkanen, you take a lot of stuff with it. Points, threes, free throws, field goal percent. Because he's, say, average or better in basically all of those things, particularly the percentages, anything you take away from those is a negative. It's not like if you took a shot away from Trae Young, you're like, well, yeah, you lose the points and threes, but at least you gain something in field goal percent to mitigate some of the other loss. With Markkanen, it's just L's across the board every time you take a tenth of a field goal attempt away from him. Still, despite all of that, because the second round gets so murky and so ugly in fantasy drafts, it's hard to say you're going to find a better option at like pick 20 if he falls that far. 17, 18, something like that. Like, even if he goes someplace where he takes a hit, he's probably still going to be a top 25 fantasy play or top 30, I would think, at basically the absolute worst anywhere he goes. So at least you can kind of guarantee your second round pick is not going to be a train wreck, which we have a few of those every year. It almost feels like the second round should just be avoid the train wreck in fantasy now. All right, that's the first half of our double dip here on Thursday. Those that have been listening to these episodes after the fact, those listening on audio, you know that the shows get broken up into two chunks. Those watching on video, you can just watch straight through. We're going to cover the Dallas Mavericks here in like 10 seconds. Those that are listening, you'll just hear one show fade out and you'll hear another show fade in. So take a deep breath and let's talk Dallas Mavericks. The Mavericks, and by the way, to those that are, again, listening after the fact, welcome back into a new episode. The Mavericks made a bunch of changes this offseason, and yet somehow, we spent almost a half an hour on Utah. I don't think we're going to come close to that on Dallas because that team is so ridiculously top-heavy. The Mavs are the poster child team for top-heavy. Let's look at after the trade deadline. So the last 2 months of this most recent season, the Mavericks had the number 4 player in fantasy, Luka, the number 9 player in fantasy, Kyrie Irving, the number 66 player in fantasy was Daniel Gafford in only 21 minutes a game and 6 field goal attempts. And PJ Washington, thanks to a defensive mega surge, managed to post number 102 value down the stretch. largely because he was a monster the last 3-4 weeks of the year, and he carried that right into a robust playoff run. But it actually wasn't. It was more like kind of a quiet month for PJ, and then a slightly, maybe it was like quiet 5 weeks, good last 3 weeks, something like that. You guys are watching me flip through the different ways of organizing this stuff. So PJ Washington, who maybe is the guy we should start with here, over the last 3 weeks last season, shot 45% from the field, and he ended up inside the top 70. Over the last 2 weeks, he shot 46.5% from the field, and he ended up at number 52 in 9 category leagues. But, and we kind of have to do the but game, we have to treat PJ Washington as the guy he's been, which prior to those 3 weeks hadn't really typically been a 46, 47 or better field goal percent guy. He was at 44.7 throughout his career. And because he's a low to mid 30% three-point shooter who's jacking them up from out there, even if the 2-point field goal percent is decent, he's still going to have trouble getting to a decent overall field goal percent mark because he's not that good of a three-point shooter. But what he did do with Dallas to cover up some of that stuff was he averaged 2.1 combined defensive stats. That's the best for PJ since 2021 to 2020 to 2021. That was that 72-game season where he averaged 2.3 in 30 and a half minutes with Charlotte. He's never been a bad defensive player, a defensive stats guy. He's hovered around 2 for stretches before, but he typically needs enough playing time to get there. And in Dallas, he got it. He was back up at 32 plus minutes per ball game for, again, the first time in a couple of years. That's a big deal. PJ, if you look at the PJ Washington progression, which, you can go back to some years in Charlotte where it seemed like he was more kind of part of the in crowd, and then maybe that changed a little bit. But I think it was 2 seasons back, he was number 97. But that's kind of where he maxes out for a whole year. The way he pushes beyond that is shooting 46, 47% for the season instead of 44 and change. That's how he gets inside the top 90, inside the top 80, that kind of deal. Because it's not going to come from a robust increase in usage. He took 12.3 shots per game over the last 2 weeks of the year, but he took 10.5 during his time in Dallas, and that's probably a more accurate count for him, especially now that Klay is in town. I would argue PJ Washington kind of became the third guy for Dallas, and Klay now slots into that job. So PJ Washington, not a guy I'm taking a shot on this year. I don't think he's going to get enough field goal attempts consistently while the team is healthy. He'll probably have some 2-week stretches where he gets warm and a guy gets hurt, and he's likely the starting power forward for the Mavs, who I'm thinking are probably Luka, Kyrie, Klay, PJ, Gafford. But again, if you're only getting to 10 shots per game out of Washington, it's going to have to be 2.3 or more, probably defensive stats, to get him inside the top 100. And I don't know if we're going to get there reliably. You could argue there's a little bit of upside with PJ built in because, what if Kyrie misses 20 games? What if Luka misses 20 games? These things can happen. This team went to the finals. They're going to be pretty exhausted coming into this coming season. It's hard to play that deep into June, 2 months longer than other teams, and still be well enough rested come October. I know it seems like a long time, but these NBA players, their bodies get accustomed to 5 or 6 months off, so you only give them 3.5 or 4. It's a different monster. Plus Luka in the Olympics, that's another thing to think about. One of those guys goes down, then all of a sudden PJ gets a dozen shots per game, and then he has that kind of top 75 potential built in. Is that a reason to take a shot on him? In Roto, I'm inclined to say no, because then you end up just having to sit on a dude and hope. With head-to-head, I might be more inclined to say maybe or even okay. Because then you get, top 125, just kind of plodding value for a while, which isn't great, but it doesn't hurt your team necessarily. And at least he won't be putting up zeros there, you hope. And then you get these 2-3 week runs blended in whenever a superstar on the team goes down, 4 games, whatever it is, where PJ goes robust for a few weeks. And that's useful because when you roll that all together and he finishes the year at, number 105, 109, 113 or something, but plays in 75 ball games, that plays in head-to-head. Provided I can get him at pick 130. Let's go over to the big man spot next. Daniel Gafford was the starter for the Mavericks. I expect that to continue. Derek Lively, the second, is the backup, but those guys were kind of just splitting minutes. It took the Mavs about 3 weeks to finally give Gafford a little bit more reliable run. And once they did that, he was a top 65 guy. Last month of the year for Gafford, he played 24 minutes a game, averaged 11 and 6. I'd like to see more blocks, frankly, but PJ Washington was out there scooping him up. And then, Luka at the guard spot was averaging 10.5 during that run. But Gafford, 0.8 steals, 1.9 blocks. He shot 79% from the field. Remember, he went 4 straight games without missing a shot. That was freaking crazy, by the way. And I think you'll probably be able to get Gafford a little bit later, because I don't think he's going to be getting full starters minutes. I think they're going to be splitting it up. There'll be some hot hand stuff going on. If they play well on a Derek Lively game, there'll just be a night where Gafford gets 19 minutes instead of 25. And it'll probably average out to around 24. That would be my guess. But Gafford in 24 minutes is a top 75 guy. If you can get him there or later, I'm very much okay with that. Like I mentioned, PJ Washington outside the top 125, 130 would be my area of targeting. Derek Lively, I'm probably not drafting. Let's get into the 3 big names on the Mavs now. You guys have been waiting on this one, I'm assuming. The Klay Thompson signing is fine because the Mavs were able to basically turn Tim Hardaway Jr. into a much, much better version of Tim Hardaway Jr. A more consistent version. I think you could argue bigger. I'm not sure that either one of those guys has the speed to stop anyone on the defensive side these days. Klay used to before his knee blew out, or his leg blew out twice. But does it make the Mavericks a ton better? A little bit. I guess it comes down to, and all these things, and this is the question marks. This is what makes fantasy so much fun and what makes tracking basketball so entertaining for me, at least, and I'm hoping for you guys as well, is we haven't seen it, but is the old Klay's 3-point stroke still in there somewhere? This most recent season, Klay's number of field goal attempts was the lowest it's been in 9 years. And the frequency of 3-pointers was the biggest it's ever been for Klay. He took 9 3-pointers a game out of a total of 14.7 shots overall. So actually, his 2-point field goal percent was pretty good. He shot 50% from 2, which is better than his career mark and significantly better than each of the last 2 years. He shot 39% from 3, which is lower than his career mark by a couple of ticks. And again, we don't know, does that number, it bounces around with guys. For a long time, Klay was extraordinarily consistent. He was between 40 and 43% every single year for, 6-7 years in a row. And then after the 2 injuries, he had a 38.5, a 41 last year, and then 38.7 this most recent season. Could he get back to 41 from downtown? Would that be enough if he maintains the 50% 2-point shooting? Would that bump in 3-point field goal percent? Would that get him up to 45% from the field? It'd be pretty damn close, I'll tell you that. But we're doing a little bit of hair splitting here. And the reason that I want to kind of pare that back is that even if Klay has a better shooting season, I'm not convinced there are enough shots for Klay to post fantasy value this year. He was number 103 last season, taking almost 15 shots per game. Do we think there are 15 shots left for Klay behind Luka and Kyrie? When that team is fully healthy, when the Mavs are fully healthy, the answer in my eyes is a resounding no. How could it be? Luka and Kyrie combined to take almost 43 shots a game last year. Scratch that. They took exactly 43 shots a game last year combined, the second half of the season. Fine, you take Tim Hardaway's 10 shots and you can just port those right over to Klay. But where does he find another 4? Who of these guys that barely are getting any shots anyway are going to give up a combined 4 to Klay Thompson on a Mavs team that also just brought in Spencer Dinwiddie to be a backup guard as well? Not that he's going to take a bunch of shots, but it's not like you can be like, oh, Josh Green got traded. Yeah, but Josh took 7. I just find it hard to, and I realize that we're kind of fuzzy mathing this thing a little bit, but you guys know me. My main goal in this podcast, in the way I play fantasy sports, is to get the most out of the least. Let me do 60, 80 hours a week of staring at basketball stuff, and let me bring you that in, 5 to 7 hours of podcasting during the season every week, and less than that in the off season. But simplify the game. So let's simplify the math here. How do you get to 15 shots for Klay? He gets every single shot that Tim Hardaway Jr. left behind, and a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit here and a little bit there. I don't think it happens when the team is healthy. It just feels complicated. It's not impossible, but it's complicated. But Kyrie Irving tends to miss a lot of time. He played only 58 out of 82 games last year. Luka played 70. And as we mentioned, these guys made the long run through to the finals, expecting them to just magically get back to 70 games each again this coming season. Feels like a big ask from the two superstars. Are their missed games going to be staggered? Is it going to come at the same time? That's hard to know. But that, I think, is the strongest argument for drafting Klay Thompson around pick 100. That's the argument. Because when the team's healthy, I don't think Klay is inside the top 120. But because this team has one superstar in Kyrie Irving that basically hasn't gotten to 75% of his team's games, but for like one time in the last 6 years, and another one in Luka, who played through everything during the playoffs, and he still looks a little bit dinged up even during this sort of pre-Olympic stuff going on the last couple weeks. Is Luka going to be 100% on opening night? I doubt it. Is Kyrie ever really 100% for more than 2.5 weeks at a time? No, not really. So you could make an argument that Klay Thompson will probably have 20 to 25 games this year where he gets to soak up, I don't know. Look at the Tim Hardaway games when one of the superstars was out. Suddenly he was taking 17 shots a night. You give Klay that type of usage, and now you're talking about the Klay Thompson from days of yore. He's never going to get back what he used to do on the defensive side. He used to be a 1 steal per game guy, and now he's at like 0.6, 0.7. That part of his game has evaporated with the exploded leg. But if you can get him for whatever, we're talking, that's like 2 months worth of games almost, where he's getting these 16, 17, 18 shots that he used to get in Golden State. You can do, again, fuzzy math it a little bit. Look at the 2018-2019 season for the Warriors. Klay took 18 shots. He was number 30. Yeah, he was at 1.7 defensive stats. But even if you bring those down to 1.2 instead of 1.7, you're still talking about a guy who was top 50. So I think you'll probably get about 20 to 25 games where Klay Thompson is a top 50 fantasy player this year. And in basically every format, that's useful. But it's about understanding whether or not your team can handle the path it's going to take to get there, which is opening night, and maybe they force feed him because he's the new guy, but like game 2, Klay's probably going to get 12 shots. And Klay Thompson with 12 shots is top 150. Klay Thompson with 17 shots is about 100 slots better. Can your team, if it's Roto, can you stick him on the bench? If you use an 8th or 9th round draft pick on him, can you just squat on him until someone gets hurt? Can your team handle that bench slot being occupied? Head-to-head, can you handle having a guy who's posting top 150 range value for the first month of the year before you get to use him more effectively? What if you get to your fantasy playoffs in head-to-head and the Mavs are healthy for those 3 weeks? Do you end up having to drop Klay at that point? It's a weird path, but one I think we can see somewhat clearly the way it's going to shake itself out, and that feels like how it's going to be. So figure out if your team can handle it, and if it can, delightful. And then, of course, you've got the big dogs on this team, but I don't think you guys need me to talk about them all that much, other than to say they're good. Kyrie Irving was number 9 per game last year in 9-cat, 25.5 points, 3 threes, 5 boards, 5 assists, 1.8 combined defensive stats, 50-91. If you're rounding, were the splits. Those are very good. Very, very good. But he's going to miss a third of the season. Okay, fine. Call it a quarter. Call it a quarter of the season. So I don't know. I mean, head-to-head, I don't know how you draft Kyrie. Because drafting a guy who you know is going to miss a quarter of the season is a recipe for extreme headaches, especially because you're probably going to have to draft him in the second round. Roto, you could get away with it. Drafting him in the second round, it wouldn't end your team, but the odds that he gets to his totals rank matching the ADP, pretty low. If you draft Kyrie at like number 15 and he plays in, well, we saw it this last year, and he plays in 58 out of 82 games. I mean, even if he got to like, oh, hell, even if you gave him like 63 out of those 80 some odd games, he still probably doesn't quite get to it. 58 got him to number 27 by totals. So you sort of lost about a round of value on the total side. 64 probably gets him to around his ADP. So do you think Kyrie's going to play 64 games? I honestly don't know. If I can get Kyrie at pick 16 or beyond in a games cap format, I probably do it. If I have to take him on the turn, I probably don't. And then with Luka, he's going to probably, he'll go top 4 in every single league. And the question is where you'd want to take him. And I think this one also comes down, frankly, pretty heavily to whether you're a head-to-head or roto player. Now, to Luka's credit, he did a lot of stuff this year that fixed the holes in his game. He shot 79% at the free throw line, so that went from being a large negative to a very small one. His field goal percent was basically league average, so he's not really hurting you in things the way he did before, other than turnovers, but, you know, who really cares with your first-round pick? But hyper elite in points, threes, assists, very good in rebounds, especially from the guard spot. You can't call it hyper elite because you've got these guys getting 11 or 12. But then pretty damn good in steals as well. So with Luka, you have this 4 monster stat starting point, which is such a nice way to build out your head-to-head league. With Roto, frankly, I'd rather have a guy in the top 3 that maybe isn't quite as good at points or threes or boards or assists, but maybe is a little bit better in the percentages to give me, 6 or 7 good categories as opposed to 4 insanely awesome ones. And so Luka then sort of steers a little bit more towards a head-to-head player's top 3 guy, and a roto player is probably more like 4 or 5. Splitting hairs, yeah, but format is going to make a difference. Like, I'd way rather have Nikola Jokic over Luka Doncic, which is like, again, what a wonderful problem to have. But there's a reason that Jokic thumped him in value this year. And it's because he was just better at more things. Luka beat him in points and threes. They were pretty damn close in assists and steals. And Jokic beat him in rebounds, blocks, field goal percent, free throw percent, and turnovers. That matters. It matters. So, again, hair splitting, yes, but I think that's something towards the top of the board. Lorenzo, what's up, buddy? Lorenzo in the chat room was asking if I'm going to organize leagues like we used to do at Sports Ethos. I haven't made up my mind yet. A good friend of the program offered to actually just organize and run them, so it's probably going to be hard for me to say no on that front. But it's not a big part of my plan. I do want to build out that community element, though. So the answer, Lorenzo, is probably yes. I'm not going to be in them, but we'll call them old man squad leagues. I don't know. It'll be a fun thing to do. Probably launching maybe around the same time that we get the Discord going for Old Man Squad Network, and the different hosts can pop in there to talk about their shows. And I think that'll be a lot of fun. So that community element is something that's still kind of on the way, but not quite ready yet. But hopefully the answer to your question, Lorenzo, will we have some leagues, is yes, Old Man Squad leagues. Would be cool to get a few different sports going too, because we got, Joe Arico. He could help kind of figure out what should happen on the baseball side. I don't know. Big plans, but baby steps. We got a lot we got to cover here. All right, that'll about wrap it up for us today. That was the double dip gear again on Thursday. I think we might be doing another double dip tomorrow. Yeah, I don't believe I have a guest tomorrow. And check me out later today with Jesse Severe. That should be a lot of fun. We're going to be on the Dynasty Sports Life podcast. That'll be, I don't know if you guys know this, that's a member of the In This League Network. My really good buddies, Bogman, the Welsh, and Jesse, of course. I'll be on that show. I don't know if that's running live or not, or if it's taped. Whoops. Either way, that'll be coming out soon. We'll be talking Pacific Division, both redraft and dynasty bent. So that'll be on, that's what I'm going to be guesting on later today. But I think tomorrow here on this show, we will do 2 more teams from the Southwest. Maybe we'll finish up the Texas trio, or maybe we'll do Memphis. I don't know. Maybe we'll go to Bed Bath & Beyond if there's time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Like, rate, subscribe. Please, por favor, I beg of you all. I'm Dan Besbris, at Dan Besbris on Twitter, at Old Man Squad. If you want to follow the main one there, it will also follow you back. I try to check in on that once every 24 hours or so. So new followers of Old Man Squad, you will get a follow back in the day or two following when you do it. That way you can see when things drop. Most of the show drops are announced from that Twitter, at Old Man Squad. So make sure to go follow them as well. Like, rate, subscribe for the last time. I'm Dan Besbris. I'll see you guys again tomorrow. So long for now. I'm out.